Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Somewhere in China, there's a Paris entirely built as if it's the original Paris, but there's nobody in it. Somewhere in China, name the city. Berlin? Sure, fine, easy. London? Yeah, absolutely. London of what era? Any era. However, the fun part is to consider that somewhere in China, this has to do with bubbles, with the property bubble, with the printing of money in China, infinite printing of money in China, and the great big build-up of a collapse that's imminent sometime in the 21st century. Somewhere in China, I like to imagine, and I welcome my friend Gordon Chang of Forbes.com and our colleague Fraser, Howie, co-author of Red Capitalism, the Fragile Financial Foundation of China's Extraordinary Rise. Gentlemen, I consider that somewhere in China, I've had a breakthrough moment. There's a studio just like mine, with a control room that I'm facing, just like mine, somewhere in China. Just one of them now. And I'm not there, but they've built it exactly to specs. Fraser, have I got it right? Somewhere in China, there's a duplicate of everything we can find in America. Good morning to you.
Good evening to you, John and Gordon. If it's not been built yet, it's probably on somebody's plan to be built. There's certainly been a lot of building. There's certainly been a lot of copying. How much productive return it's going to give is anybody's guess.
And this is called ghost cities, right, Gordon? But we're going beyond ghost cities now. It's not just that. They're ghost corners. They're ghost grocery stores. They're ghost radio studios. They'll build anything because that's the way they're generating GDP, non-productive GDP. It's like somebody pushed a button, Gordon, and nobody can turn it off.
Absolutely, John. They're ghost provinces. Our friend Ann Stevenson Yang just sent me a message about an hour ago, and she just went to a city called Yinchuan, which I've never heard of. It's 1.2 million people. She got a list of the property that is currently on sale in this city, and the number of units totals about one-third the number of new homes that were sold in the United States in 2012. This is one backwater city which is completely unknown to most people, and it has essentially one-third the U.S. inventory. Now, this is striking because, there are about 300 or 400 of these cities around China, and they've all become ghost cities.
Fraser, why are they doing this? They know that it's not sustainable, so why?
Well, I think the problem is that it's not sustainable, but people's focus is short-term. There's a short-term incentive to build property to develop. First of all, because it suits the leaders to get growth numbers. It's easy growth, as it were. They know how to build. It's seen as development. It suits the local leaders who are basically seizing farmland to give to developers. There's a big mark upon it. They get their kickback. And then the developers to sell property. I think China's a land of contradictions, and there is something that should not be forgotten in this, that there is demand for property as well. And again, I'm actually in central China at the moment, and I've been speaking with my in-laws are Chinese, and we've actually been talking about property. And there's a demand for people to upgrade, partly because a lot of the property stock in China is so poor and continues to be poor. If you bought a property 10 years ago, it's already largely run down, and you're looking to move up the ladder. You've personally got richer, perhaps. You're looking for better facilities. You're looking for a better area. So there is a demand there. But the supply is far outstripping the demand. And so you certainly are never going to get the returns that they're expecting. But it's all short-term gains, and they're not thinking long-term at the moment.
Gordon, in this country, we learned what property flipping leads to, which is the Great Recession and the crash. That has not happened in China, or it has happened in China. But Gordon, they're making it worse. I know all bubbles go too far. That's irrational exuberance. But there seems to be some self-awareness that the Chinese can't stop themselves, but they know this all comes tumbling down. Is that correct?
That's correct, John, that essentially there's a momentum, as Fraser talks about, that there are these short-term incentives. Also because the Chinese leaders really don't know what to do. They've sort of got onto this treadmill, and they realized that if they stopped building, that the economy would just collapse. And so they don't want that, which means that they're really just trying to live day by day. And that's very dangerous because this game has got to end. The reason why it's got to end is that property prices have gotten so high that essentially, as one example that people talk about, and that is it takes the average worker 40 years of salary to buy a 1,100 square foot apartment. Now, there is demand for these apartments because people are using them as store of value. In other words, instead of buying gold coins, they buy apartments. But at some point, these apartments have to be sold and put onto the market, and essentially they have just outrun economic reality.
Fraser, what can go wrong and why? Back in 2006, I can review some of the audio I did back then, talking to people about the property bubble that we could see in 2006. However, at the time, no one was telling me it would pull the whole world economy down. When the U.S. housing went bang down and the banks went flip rotten and Congress lost its mind and started printing money and pouring money along with the Federal Reserve, that the whole world would tremble. Now, we know now that that's what a property bubble in the United States looks like. Is that the same thing as the property bubble in China, or is this too small, isolated, eccentric a market to rip us all down?
No, it's certainly not too small, and you've certainly seen collapses in certain cities. Wenzhou, which has been a hotbed and basically the center of private industry in China, has seen collapsing house prices anywhere between 30 to 80% down, depending on what sort of properties you're looking at. So you can get some very sharp corrections. I think, though, there is some differences because although China is integrated with the world economy from a trade perspective, it isn't necessarily from a capital perspective to such an extent. So the impacts will be more muted. You'll certainly have the impacts. What you'll see is as the Chinese economy slows, as the growth ultimately must slow down sharply, commodity prices will fall. That's going to impact a lot of commodity suppliers. You're going to see, Australian miners being hurt very sharply. You're going to see emerging markets as a whole taking a hit as money flees from emerging markets. You're going to see China buying less and less goods because China is no longer becoming as rich as it once was. You're not going to necessarily see as many rich Chinese going overseas, perhaps. So you are going to have impacts there. But it's going to be a different, when they say this time is different, it's not that there's not going to be a crisis, but the crisis is always in a different way, and the impacts will be different. The beauty, if you like, of the American economy, while it does produce these very nasty shocks, it can rebalance, and it is a very flexible, the society is flexible, the economy is flexible. That's not the case in China. It's much more brittle. And I think the worst impacts will be faced by the Chinese themselves, but the world economy will also suffer as well, as China is no longer seen as the engine of growth as it once was.
Gordon?
Well, Fraser, everything you say is true, but of course there's the psychological impact. And, even if the property market in China is isolated, and I think you're right that it is, at least initially in terms of a crisis, I think the problem will be people around the world will say, oh my God, the Chinese economy is falling apart. And I think that what you'll have...
That's right. Yes.
Because, every time we have these little shocks in China, like some regulation is issued or some number doesn't meet expectations, we see the problems not only in the Chinese stock market, but in stock markets in Asia. And then, of course, it ripples through Asia, and eventually at the end of the trading day for the world, it rocks the Dow Jones. And so I think that what you're going to see is that when there's a really big crisis in China, it's just going to shock the hell out of people.
Yes, no, the psychology is certainly true because China is certainly overplayed, I think, and the importance of it is overplayed often. But you're right, so when there is the shock, when there is a full realization of the problems here, then it's going to have that impact. The question is, though, if you're waiting for a Lehman Brothers moment where one event triggers it, where one bank goes down or one developer goes down, I find that very difficult to believe. I can't see how the government's going to allow that to happen. They're going to suffer from much poorer growth going forward, but I really struggle to see how you're having that Lehman Brothers a weekend where, do the banks open on Monday type of questions are asked. That I find much harder to see, at least in the short term.
Gentlemen, I mentioned that the just-in news from several sources confirms that the House has approved the bill earlier this evening, approved by the U.S. Senate, and the government reopening bill the agreement now goes to the president for signature. So therefore, the end of the world will not be tomorrow. We will kick it down to January. Fraser, just quickly here at the end, Gordon has taught me that China will get old before it gets rich. Does the old China have less defenses or more defenses from the collapse that's coming?
No, I think less defenses. I think that's China. It's an old, weak, and poor China. And as I say, when I look at my own in-laws and family here in China, basically everyone's either retired or nearing retirement. Nobody's working. There's a great big gap of basically people between the ages of 10 and 40. There's nobody actively working. And so you have to, that's not a healthy future for China by any means.
Fraser Howie, co-author of Red Capitalism, The Fragile Financial Foundation of China's Extraordinary Rise, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. And somewhere in China is my studio waiting for me. I'm John Batchelor.